see if that works. In a typical economist fashion, I have slides. It's very interesting because to me, cycles in economics, in finance, are really one of the most dominant themes in both of those disciplines. It's a dominant theme because ultimately cycles drive human behavior, and human behavior drives economics and finance. Obviously, it's a two-way street. Yes, we learn from the economics and finance from the environment we generate. So there is a knock-on effect. So if there is a first-order cycle, if you want, which drives us to make certain innovations, certain change, adopt certain change, implement it, deploy it in the economy, then there is a knock-on effect from us learning from that change as well. So interestingly enough, this year we have the centenary of the sinking of Titanic. We think of Titanic as a kind of, historical artifact. But as a historical artifact, it also goes back to the issues of cycles. It probably denotes or marks one of the transition periods in a cycle which is very long in human history. Long cycle meaning its duration is very long, yes? It's a cycle of the way we as humans approach knowledge. And it's the cycle between the determinism, the age of steel, the age of engineering. We can do everything through science, we can do everything through engineering, we can span any rivers, any canyons and all. We can build the largest boat in the world and it will float. To the cycle of kind of Gnosticism, skepticism. To the cycle of, oh yes, we believe in nationalist symbols. We believe in little, crosses and things like that, which signify something for us intangible, such as us belonging to a race. Sinking of Titanic, in many ways, predated or started the beginning of the cycle of the switch from the age of enlightenment, the age of, industrial really enlightenment, the age of determinism, to the age of that Gnosticism and psychological attitude towards the reality. If you think about it in political terms, it was the beginning of the rise of fascism, the beginning of the rise also of communism, both kind of symbolically driven types of the ideologies which are not driven on, say, deterministic formula of management, but rather on belonging to a certain group. Also, this, if you want, semiotics of the symbols of both of those movements very much are emotive or emotional as well, yes? There is another interesting pattern which came with Titanic, with the marker of the Titanic. Change was very abrupt, yes? After the Titanic, there was a profound, if you want, change in the society overall, political and social. We had the World War within a year time. Not that Titanic caused it, I'm not saying that, but it certainly marked that departure, yes? We had, again, emergence and the popularization of certain political movements and ideologies. If you think about that exactly age, what's happening in the arts, what's happening in the kind of, if you want, philosophy itself, there is the same type of shift as well happening. The other second thing which we can learn from it is that though the change itself might be abrupt, the past innovation or past trends which were driving the cycle in the first place actually can last longer than the marker and the change that is underlying happening in itself. Engineering didn't fade. The age of engineering lasted into 1920s, in fact, after the Titanic. It just became more and more skeptical, yes, and it also moved geographically. So anyways, so it's quite interesting to talk about cycles overall. There's a classical cycle, if you want, and that classical cycle underlies time series or underlies data, or underlies the trends to me, in finance and economics, and it's almost pretty much always invariably identical. The language, the words, the signifiers can change, but really the dynamics are the same. You always start the cycle with some sort of the technological or software innovation or shock. Something happens exogenously to disturb you out of the equilibrium. When that happens, you trigger the process of simultaneously change in the underlying series. So, for example, technological innovation triggers higher productivity growth. Okay? The new gadget or a new widget invented or a new process invented drives higher productivity. But on the other side, there is a behavioral change as well. And the behavioral change usually relates to our expectations of future change in the real world. So as the productivity is rising, the expectation of future productivity growth is rising faster than the actual productivity growth itself. At the early stages, there's a bit of a lag, yes? It takes time for the investors, it takes time for the economic agents, managers and companies and all to catch up with that process of productivity increases. So there is a lag, and therefore everything is all right. The expectations are still lagging. At a certain point in time, the expectations go up above the actual productivity growth rate, and we start forming a bubble. Again, it applies to finance, it applies to technologies, it applies to the real economies, it applies to physical stuff, it applies to the pricing of risk and everything else as well. Thereafter, for a while, expectations continue rising faster than actual productivity growth. And productivity growth can be very steep, yes? It can be, the returns can be very high from the new technology as well in the early stages. At a certain point in time, the expectations start catching up again. They start slowing down. When expectations slow down, investment slows down, okay? And as a result of that, the productivity again peaks at the level and catches up with the expectations. And we go into the collapse. And that's when the bubble deflates. We go into the process of moving towards the trough of disillusionment, whereby our expectations are so negative of the future that they are below the actual growth rates and productivity. Then there is a bit of an adjustment, yes? There are different types of investors who hold different portfolio strategies and even investment funds nowadays which actually follow those cycles, yes? There is hedges, there are smart money, there are value-driven investors who all try to time that cycle and anticipate where we are in terms of the development of the gap between the expectations of the marketplace overall, in other words, the prices we attach to things, and the reality as to what the fundamentally underlying pricing should be, okay? Now, what afterwards? What's interesting is that afterwards, the new technology, or by that time already mature technology, and the productivity effects of that technology, or that shock itself, doesn't completely disappear, it doesn't go to zero. It actually rises slightly from the overshooting of the expectations and then stays at a steady rate. It continues to contribute to overall progress, to overall growth, we all benefit from it. It's just not the driver of future growth anymore. This is very interesting to me because A, it relates to both finance and economics, but B, because I actually honestly do believe that we are somewhere in the stage of hitting that type of the if you want, part of the cycle, of very long cycle. I'll talk about it in a little bit in more detail. So let's start with the starting of the cycle. It's interesting enough. This is a picture of the Grand Station in Michigan, in Detroit, the railroad station in Detroit. And this is the old picture of it, when it actually had all the windows and still had the facade, and there were actually trees around and people, and the grass was trimmed. Interestingly enough, I chose it to start the discussion of the cycle and to mark the beginning of the cycle, because psychologically as human beings, when somebody tells you we're at the beginning of the cycle, the beginning always has the positive connotation to it. In other words, we always think of a cycle starting at the point where things are going to be brighter down the line. That's not necessarily true all of the time. This is just arbitrary thing from the point of view, kind of, if you want, scientific point of view, because you can start the cycle anywhere. You can start the cycle from the point where things are going to go down, okay? But psychologically, we do so. And that tells you that there is always psychologically a bias in us in believing that in the future things are going to be brighter or better. That bias actually tends to drive huge amount of the cyclical behavior in economics and finance. That bias is also behind, if you want, the whole issue of the bubble formation in finance and asset bubbles themselves. So it's interesting enough that cyclicality is linked to this overexuberance that we have, and that overexuberance or over-optimism is present all of the time. We attach the values even to things like the beginnings of the cycle. So anyways, there are different types of cycles, and I'll talk about them in a context of both different markets, different type of, you know, say finance versus economics, and economics technology versus growth, and things like that. But also they're different in terms of their dynamics, in terms of their timing. In terms of their dynamics, for example, there are cycles where we can confirm the cyclical behavior. In other words, like here, there you can see there's a time series from the 1800s in terms of the GDP growth in the United States. Now, this is now confirmed. There is no doubt that this is cyclical behavior. There is also interesting dynamics in it because it's already starting to show even there that in that primitive time series, the cycles themselves are not necessarily cyclical. So if you look at the gaps between the cycles, you look at the rate of the, oh sorry, not the rate, but like say the duration of the cycle itself from say, for example, throw to the next throw or from the peak to the next peak, yes? They all are different in periods. Interestingly enough, if you extend this time series into the present, which a lot of research is done, you will find that that is true. The peaks are becoming larger, higher, the throws becoming deeper, the cycles becoming more compressed. That's quite interesting. On average, there is no really predictability in what we call second order of the cycle itself, such as the dynamics of the cycle. But nonetheless, things are very cyclical there. The gray line there is just the technical trending of the cycle, and it's known as a Kondratiev curve. It goes back to the 1930s studies, and even in the late 19th century, it was already known that this is a cyclical behavior in itself. So this is not new, yes? The science of cycles in economics is certainly not new. So what is there? The one thing is that always present is, in a cycle is that there is always some sort of the mispricing going on. At no point in the cycle we're at equilibrium. The points where we're at equilibrium is when we hit the mean, and we don't stay at that mean usually. If I were to trend this in a linear trend, there would be slightly gently rising slope of the straight line, yes? And you can see that there is no periods, appreciable periods, where it is actually at that particular trend, okay? So they're always present there. The other thing is what's interesting about this type of cycles, that systematic cycles are actually very long in nature. They can be generational. This is something we don't appreciate because we constantly think in terms of economics about business cycles. And business cycles are measured in months, maybe quarters, yes? So like even a long business cycle, 2 years, okay? Officially, Irish recession is about 2 years long, the last great recession. Well, if you take it into the context of life and I tell you that, say 20 years from now, every one of us is going to experience 2 years of slowdown, we ain't gonna worry about it too much. If I tell you that in the next year, we experience a slowdown, of course we will worry a bit more, yeah? If I tell you that in the next year we're going to experience a slowdown for 3 quarters rather than 2 years, you will worry actually more about this 3 quarters than 2 years down the line. That's a normal human nature. We discount the future. We discount also the possibilities of long events. But in reality, if you look at this chart there, this is a generational effect. There are generations which are caught in those cycles. So if we think about ourselves as a generation, where are we right now? Are we in a normal business cycle? That's a very big question for us. Policymakers in Ireland today, talking about economic growth, for example, and recovery from the crisis and everything else, don't bother actually asking that question, interestingly enough. Perhaps because the answer to it is really frightening. I don't know, or maybe not. Maybe they just haven't gotten to it yet because they've been fighting forest fires in general. This is what the business cycles look like in their traditional form. The orange line in Irish GDP, it's smoothed out, so that's all there is to it. It looks, just remove a little bit the peaks, and you can see the picture there, yes? Things go up and down in terms of the GDP growth all of the time. It's interesting that there are, even in terms of business cycles, we don't have a fully confirmed singular definition of what the business cycle is. There are official definitions of the business cycle, such as, for example, by the National Bureau of Economic Research in the United States, which relate the cycle, and even they actually produce 2 of them. They relate the cycle either to the consecutive 2 quarters of either growth or contraction, or they can relate it to the 2 consecutive quarters of below or above the trend growth. Now, if we for example, talk about the trend growth, then the trend in itself, I'll go back to the previous slide there, then the trend itself is cyclical as well. So the cycles are cyclical in themselves, but not cyclical in their dynamics. That's quite interesting in itself. So how do business cycles start? How does that behavior happen? Well, let's start instead of the optimistic position with a pessimistic start, early recession. What happens in a low recession? In the early recession? In the early recession, we have low confidence or low animal spirits in a kind of old language of Adam Smith. Therefore, we have lower demand, and we also have underlying lower profits at the corporate level or companies level or at the economy level. And we also have the profits expectations, which are still driven by the past. So in other words, they are slightly above, and they're catching up to the downside with the actual profits themselves. In the end of the early recession, we confirm expectations. In other words, the expectations catch up with reality in itself as well. And at that point, we move to what's known as late recession. With late recession, we have recovering or stabilized confidence. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's upticks, but it's just steady and it's predictable and it's no longer driving downward the demand, so the demand stabilizes as well. As the demand stabilizes, you have the low expectation of profit still remaining. It's lagging. Because the analysts don't have a perfect power of foresight, they have the comfort zone of the past data. The past data forces them to lag in expectations, but at the same time, actual profits start gradually improving. As a gradual improvement in profits happens, the expectations also start turning, and they're starting to catch up with the growth in profits. We move into the early expansion stage. The cautious expectations increases themselves in the early expansion stage are still being outpaced by the profits growth and the demand growth itself. So there is a positive surprise, what we call. The expectation of the future profit is lower than the future profit realization. And as a result of that, investment starting to rise, and we move into the late expansion stage. And here we have high expectation of the profits at the same time as demand slows down in growth. And as demand slows down in growth, you have the lower profit growth in the real world. Expectation now outpaces or exceeds the profits that are being generated. Investment slows down, and we have a negative surprise, and we move into the cycle of the early recession again. Is that mechanical? Well, if it is mechanical purely, then as human beings, we can divorce ourselves from it. We can detach ourselves from it. We can break the pattern of cyclicality. Where else can you look for the possibility of breaking away from the pattern of cyclicality? Well, surely not where millions of us or billions of us interacting with no control, not in the marketplace for matches or cigarette lighters or candles or bread. More like into the market where the policymakers are singular. They're fairly individual. We know them. They get together. They collude in their decision-making, or they discuss the decision-making that they're going to adopt. The best lab for that is the monetary policy determination committees, the likes of the Governing Council of the ECB, the Fed deliberations, and all. We would expect there to have a lack of cyclicality. We would expect there to have the decision-making which actually induces forceful departures from the cyclicality if the cyclicality is not underlying human nature. Well, we don't actually see that. With exception for Japan, in the long term, kind of in the long run, everything is cyclical. Notice the trend is down, but around the trend, thing is still cyclical, yes? Now, why is Japan different? Well, I mean, Japan is unique in many ways. I mean, it's just in such a mess from 1980s, from 1990 really starting, but 1980s was the driver of the mess which started afterward, that you can actually put it into unique territory. We keep hearing about unique cases today, all of the time. Yes, Cyprus is unique, Ireland is unique, Portugal is unique, But really, in this world so far, there's only Japan which is unique, okay? Everything else is pretty much not unique in many ways. Interestingly enough, we also relate those cycles to the kind of ages. They're longer moving cycles. Again, once again, we enter this kind of language of ages, yes? There's an age of hyperinflation, and this is 1970s and into the early 1980s. And then that was followed by the age of great moderation. This is the 1990s. You think about 1990s as being the age of great moderation when the property prices were rising in double digits. But, this is in terms of the inflation, yes? This is in terms of interest rates, structurally lower interest rates and all. Notice that there is always an overshooting in a crisis present. In other words, when we move back towards the trend, whether on a downward or on upward, we never just hit the trend and stay with it afterwards, yes? We never go like this. We always go like this, up above, and then something forces us back down, and we keep reverting and all. At the very best, what you can have is the kind of convergent cycle, where the oscillations reduce, and ultimately you're going to reach the steady state. But again, this is physics. In kind of social sciences, we don't see that. In real world, we don't observe that. And the reason why we don't observe it is because shocks continue to arrive, because we don't behave in perfectly rational and predictable way. We don't act cohesively in the same direction as gravity acts, for example, in physics, in Newtonian physics. Okay? So anyways, interestingly enough, out of this cycle, you can ask yourself, what's next then, yes? Is really the trend downward will continue? Well, sooner or later, you know, linear trend downward is going to hit zero, and you can't have nominal interest rates at zero, below zero rates, yes? You can have them at zero, but you can't have them at below zero rates, because that would mean that the government is going to be, or central bank is going to be paying you to take the money off them. Okay, in some ways they do it in real terms, but in nominal terms, how does that work? I walk into the central bank and I ask for 100 euros, and they give me 110, yes? I mean, okay, let's keep driving it ad absurdum. You know, sooner or later I wouldn't be able to walk out of the central bank. They will give me so much money I can't carry it, yes? So anyways, so that doesn't work, okay? It's interesting to think in terms of whether this really is the short cycle or the long cycle that we're talking about. The age that we talk about is decade long. Beyond the age of decade long, we know there are ages of multiple decades long, the generational decades, as in this here. And if they are that long, and can be even longer, as I'll talk in a second about different type of cycle, then there is a question, are we going to revert back to the higher interest rates? It's interesting enough, I think my next slide shows that, yeah, that's exactly what happens. That slide takes the ECB policy rate and maps it against its historical mean. So take historical average, and a deviation at any point in time from historical average, that's the blue line there. You can see that it is quite cyclical. It's in a step function, simply because there is one discrete decision making. It's not continuous in itself, yes? But you can see that cycle. Again, it's on a downward trend and trajectory, but it is oscillating around. What's interesting is the orange line. The orange line maps the duration that it takes for the cycle to revert back to the mean. So once we hit the top, how long it takes for us to hit the historical average. And then how long it deviates from the historical average and how long it takes again, yes? That in itself looks like a wave to you, doesn't it? That's cyclical in itself as well. The latest episode here, the last one there, is very long, historically longer than anything else we've seen so far, but we haven't seen a hell of a lot of them anyways. That's the 4th episode, so it's not really a meaningful comparison right now, yes? But what is meaningful is that the pattern itself repeats. And again, it is quite cyclical in itself. The time frame of the horizon is there. It's quite interesting. So in other words, we have the overshooting that happens during the policy setting or in a policy setting that is severe, and it is a first order overshooting in the blue series themselves, deviation from the linear or some other trend as well. And we have the cyclical mean reversion in the dynamics itself. So there is a second order cyclicality underlying the first order cyclicality in itself as well. This is all can be very technical, but I think the picture itself says enough. So let's get to other cycles. Let's get to cycles in economics which drive real stuff. This was monetary stuff, yes? We touched a little bit the growth. Let's talk about the underlying parameters of the growth. I mentioned technology. I mentioned innovation. It turns out that the cyclicality applies also to the way we adopt and the way we use technological innovation, knowledge, systems innovation, soft innovation, human capital, and everything else. I mentioned that cycle before. If you want, there is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 definitive stages in that cycle. There is more of them outlined there on the slide. There is this whole point of the technology trigger, which is really the shock itself, the invention of technology. That's the R&D. That's the R&D stage. It's a stage of first adoption. It's a stage of first, creating the technological innovation itself, putting it into the market, and getting to the first adopters stage. It involves finance. It involves, business systems change, creation of the supply chains, marketing chains, and everything else. But basically, up until that kind of high-level rise up there, that's the first stage. This technology is unknown. We don't know yet full returns to it. We can't really price it properly. All we can do is we can see how many people go and adopt it early enough. Beyond the early adopters, we start deploying it into the broader market. As we deploy into the broader market, we reach that peak in itself. It's hype, yes? Everybody wants to have one. Everybody is, of course, in the inverted commas. It doesn't mean that we have 100% penetration or cover of the market, but we have large masses talking about it and all. There is this whole hype in the media as well. So as interest continues to grow, that interest, intangible interest, yes? It's still not translating yet in actual returns. People are not buying that stuff yet fully. We don't know what will be the returns from it in terms of productivity or anything else, but we do know that all of the journalists are loving it. And some of them are hating it, and in the kind of Nassim Taleb's type of the world, it's the ones who are hating it are actually the most aggressive drivers in favor of it. You know, Taleb famously says usually that he doesn't like positive reviews because they don't sell books. It's the negative reviews which sell books, you know? So that's the same thing there, yes? The few outliers in the media who are criticizing technology are also driving the hype. That hype drives our expectations, but it doesn't drive the actual returns. Because at that stage, all we're doing is still creating production and deploying the product into the market. Once we have deployed the product into the market, here the stuff starts happening. First, we test the consumers, and we find out that, hey, that early adoption hype and all is not necessarily translating into the coverage in the market that we have expected. There's always that kind of adjustment in our own expectations as people who deploy the technology. But also the rest of the market starts to adjust their expectations down. The number of the negative reviews is rising. At the same time, we start discovering problems and difficulties and higher costs in terms of our production capacity and marketing capacity and the sales capacity of the new technology. So you have the supply type of consolidation, supply chain consolidation, failures in it as well. We are familiar with all those things, yes? They happen with every new technology pretty much. And what happens thereafter is that we start looking for a new means of deploying it. We start looking, correcting those tightnesses in the supply chain and the production. And as a result of that, we start raising new money. When we raise new money, we go into the last stage or the second and third rounds of what's called here venture capital financing or some other forms of the capital financing and investment. Meanwhile, the overall expectations get deflated. They're coming down back to somewhere where the actual returns are. Where the actual returns are really in the long run, and that's really is a long time horizon, which we're talking about, it's there at the end. At any point in that graph, there is this kind of average rate of return. And at any point in that graph, except the most end over there, that plateau, the expectations are either exceeding or undershooting the actual rates of return. There is mismatching between what we price on the back of expectations and what we get in the real market. And that again drives this whole cycle. So there is a throw of pessimism down there, throw of disillusionment, right there at the lowest point. It happens. And guess what? Smart money come in. Smart money invest in it on the basis of knowing that that is the overshooting in itself and the future returns will be higher than the expected returns. Therefore, the prices are currently lower than the future returns should be commanded. They come in, they invest, and they pick up that. What's interesting is that, okay, how long can this period last? Well, take, for example, the age of steam, okay? You know, that lasted about 150 years. So this whole period lasted about 150 years in the age of steam. Take electricity, for example. When was it? The first light was invented in 1879. It took until about late 1920s before electrification started to become the everyday occurrence. Up until 1970s, we still benefited in terms of productivity growth from electrification. So a very long period that time can be. Or take, for example, I don't know, current lifespan of the iPad, okay? That can be what? 9 months, 10 months, 12 months, maybe a year, maybe 2. So cycles are different in length, but ultimately they are all the same. What's interesting from my point of view is that cycles are generally, like this cycle there, are driven by the behavioral understanding, the mismatch between the behaviorally driven expectations and the real world. They can be systematic and they can be very much dynamic. They can be very much dynamic by sustaining for a long period of time a deviation from the equilibrium, even when there is enough, if you want, understanding, technical understanding, that mean reversion is going to occur. In other words, that the equilibrium is going to prevail. It's quite interesting because as human beings, we resist knowledge, we resist technology, we resist determinism. It's quite interesting because we also, as human beings, are not wired for uncertainty. Again, that's Taleb's phrase. We are not really capable of dealing with uncertainty really well. Anyways, I know the uncertainty is the topic of the next exhibition here, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. This is an example of very long cycles. And it's an example of the very long cycles, not simply because I want to throw at you an example, but because to me that example is the beginning of the really serious conversation we in this society should be having right now. It is starting as a conversation as well, but it's not yet permeating kind of our discussion in either economics, by the way, as academic economics, but also it doesn't permeate our policymakers' decision-making as well. This is a set of cycles which relates to 3 stages of the Industrial Revolution. This is a work of a number of people, but primarily it's driven in academia by Gordon, Robert Gordon, as an economist, and in kind of business economics, it's driven by Carlota Perez, from whose work this is taken, and she wrote a very famous book by now about the cyclicality there. But anyways, so it relates to the perpetual question, or the biggest challenge in economics overall. Is growth possible? No, I don't mean prosperity. Yes, prosperity is possible. Look at Japan. It has no growth, but it has prosperity. I mean, it's certainly not a poor country, is it? You know? It might be, by some analysis, it's heading into being a poor country, but for now, it's not a poor country, okay? But is growth possible? And more importantly, what do we really mean by growth possible? We mean growth above the kind of pre-industrial age average. Because before the industrial age average, the average growth rates were about 0.2% annually. Now imagine the world in which for, say, for example, 500 years, every year average growth is at 0.5% in real terms, inflation adjusted. Now, in Ireland, we can't hack it with 1% and 1.5%, okay? In Italy, they can't hack it with about 0.9% growth. In Belgium, they can't do it with 1.5% as well. What about 0.2% growth? Now, again, that relates to the whole issue of this cycle here, this technology cycle. And that's where a lot of the analysis is focusing. This analysis here just lists, about what, 5 cycles there from the traditional industrial revolution to the information and telecommunications technologies revolution itself. It also has slightly different dating from Gordon's dating, but it doesn't really matter. Again, it's always driven by exactly the same type of the dynamic as here. You have technology trigger, in other words, the installation stage. The installation stage ends at the peak of valuations of the technology in the markets, or economic valuation of the technology, the expectations peaking themselves, and then you go into the collapse and readjustment. Collapse is that throw, the disillusionment throw that you are reaching, and readjustment is realization that things are mean reverting, and they're going to revert to the mean. Except the mean here is on a rising slope. That's really is the difference. But I think this is rising slope is just simply due to the drawing itself. It's not a rising slope. Growth flattens out thereafter. It produces the base, but it no longer fuels the actual rates of growth into the future itself. It's true for the canal panics, it's true, for the canal technology and the age of water, it's true for the age of coal, it's true for the age of steel, it's true for the age of pretty much probably timber as well, okay? Interestingly enough, that up to the point of the last cycle, all of the cycles before have been driven by the exhaustion of resources, physical resources. But here, let me ask you this question then, okay? What differentiates the ICT age from all of the previous ages? Well, in the previous ages, you had to dig something out of the ground, do something with it in order to get that output which actually adds value, yes? Or you might have had to plant something, then chop it down, saw it, and produce the timber. Doesn't matter. You had to have a physical transformation of things. What do we transform in this age, in today's age? What is the resource that we're using in the current age? Well, it's certainly not physical stuff, yes? I mean, the computers are made out of plastic. Who cares? Okay? The chips are made out of silicon. Who cares? I mean, like your average beach is full of that stuff, yes? So ultimately, it's not physical stuff. The computers only are meaningful as far as there is A, software, and B, a human being who can use that software. It's a human capital because software is not materialized in physical form. It's materialized out of human capital. So the resource which is at the risk of the exhaustion in the ICT cycle, which is marked with a kind of, if you want, throw at the point of the crash in 2000 and later also the deflation of the dot-com bubble in 2001, 2002, which is a big question whether that really is a true throw. We don't know yet. There is no real confirmation of that yet. But nonetheless, okay, suppose it is. What resource was exhausted in there then? It has to be the only resource which drove it in the first place, and this is human capital. What do we mean by human capital exhaustion? What we mean by human capital exhaustion is the fact that there are a number of headwinds, what Gordon identifies as 6 headwinds, which drive down the long-term growth cycle. I'll mention them in a second, but this is really the picture of what I was talking about, a very long period of time from 1300 till early 1700s, where the world has no growth. The average growth rate is about 0.2%. That's pretty abysmal stuff. That means that, you know, things are not improving significantly. 1700s, early 1700s, you have the first industrial revolution starting. And the first industrial revolution is starting with the steam engine itself. And it takes about 150 years for the steam engine to exhaust, to go through that individual type of cycle and reach the plateau. That plateau over there, the plateau of productivity, okay? And what else is there? You know, though some parts of it, of course, of the steam engine, such as the railroads, which are kind of correlated to it, yes, the derivative of that, have lasted much longer. And in particular, for example, in the likes of, say, Russia, they've lasted, you know, up until even today. It's a major contributor to overall productivity. In fact, actually, Russians are reforming their railroads, and they're reforming them both in the context of the future policies, such as WTO accession, and also currently through the modernization as well, because it's still a huge driver. In the United States, railroads are coming slightly back, yes? I mean, it took a hell of a lot of time for the United States to start growing back in terms of the railroads on that tail end. They were flat for a very long period of time and at a very low end as well. So in different societies, of course, it takes different, you know, type of time and, you know, different levels of productivity returns. But nonetheless, it is very similar to it, okay? So then there is a second industrial revolution. The second industrial revolution starts in the 1870s, late 1870s, and in particular, it's very concentrated. It's probably one of the most concentrated industrial revolutions starts fully possible. Within the span of about 3 months in 1879, you have the invention of the internal combustion engine and the electrical light. I mean, that's spectacular, because both of those things have been biggest drivers in terms of productivity increases throughout the 20th century, much of the 20th century, let alone the end of the 19th century itself. That's the second industrial revolution. Interestingly enough, it is also associated with other things which are made possible by freeing of the resources that the technological innovations has produced. For example, there was about 10-fold increase in terms of the water supply, fresh water supply in the cities around the world during that age. This is a huge increase in terms of the improvement in sanitation, water supply, and things like that. Phone, telegraph, phonograph, motion pictures, all of those things have been invented during that period of time, adopted and deployed. By the 1930s, and into the 1940s, those things were mainstream, yes? They already have gone through the cycle of the huge returns and huge expectations and exuberance and the bubbles and everything else, yes? California bubble has collapsed by the pretty much, you know, the beginning of the 1940s as well. So anyways, the war was, of course, a disruption there. But this is, as I said before, it's a fairly longish. There's elements of that on the electricity side, which lasted into 1970s as well. So a long cycle as well. And we have the third industrial revolution. This third industrial revolution starts with 1960s, when the first mainframe computers become the mainstream of operations. They are being deployed in large corporations as well. And I never forget it, when I worked at IBM, there's a system of values of different generations, okay? I remember I went to the mothership at the Armonk, headquarters of IBM, and it's an impressive place. It's like really impressive place, especially for people like me, because if you love art, the art collection that IBM as a corporation has is really unparalleled in the world. I mean, it's like better than the Museum of Modern Art. And I never forget, I was walking with a group of us, walking through the corridor, and all of a sudden the geeks get excited. Almighty, I mean, like their eyes pop out. They run to this thing which has a lot of knobs and kind of, things to insert, plugs in and everything else, and it looks like a piano. Not a grand piano, but a thing like that. There's a bit of buttons here, and then there's a bit of things there, okay? Anyways, and they're all excited about it. And I'm standing, I'm looking right above it, and I'm excited, okay? And they don't understand why I'm not looking at that, and I don't understand why they're looking at that. So ultimately, the conversation, of course, happens between us. And they say, you don't understand. This is XB73-A. I'm like, what? Come again? And they say, like, well, this thing was the first kind of usable in business computer that IBM has built that launched the age of computing, okay? And I looked at them and I said, and that thing hanging over it is about $25 million painting from one of the greatest painters of all times, and certainly of the 20th century, called Mark Rothko. And normally, to look at it, you're going to have to endure a lot of security. But here, if I want to, I can actually poke it a little bit with a finger. Now, I'm not going to be malicious and poke it with a finger, but I can, And you don't understand, this is way more exciting and enduring than that thing. Guess what? It's interesting enough that actually probably I was right in the long run. Because if the idea of this industrial revolution cycles is true, we're getting to the point where that red line now, the last data we have, the notice really, yes, in terms of the growth, is clearly heading along the pattern of the green line, which is the trend extracted out of the actual growth series. And if it is true, then the technological revolution is over, finita la commedia. And if it is true, the growth is over, finita la commedia. And the only thing which is going to be left in this world which holds the real value is going to be Mark Rothko. Now, that's very interesting because, on the other hand, I do appreciate, of course, the historical value of technology. The other day, I was having a conversation with my better half, and she was saying, why you still have an old Apple computer in your attic, in our attic? And I said, well, dear, because if it's good enough for the Museum of Modern Art, New York, to hold one in their collection, it's good enough for me. It's the first Apple laptop, and it's in the working unique order. As in, like, about every year, I plug it in, and it still works. Now, you can't do anything with it. It doesn't even have the plug for the internet to connect, okay? Because it was produced before the internet was even there. I mean, it's still, you have to have those diskettes. I don't think I have any left anymore. Where do you buy them? On the eBay, probably. Some antiques, and all. But it's still in the working order. And it's a beautiful machine. So there might be value to the XB73-A, whatever thing it was, in the end. But it's not much more than that painting hanging over it. Anyways, is art, by the way, economically cyclical? That's a very interesting question. I don't cover it in there because it didn't occur to me when I was preparing the presentation. Art market is very interesting in itself. Art as an asset class, as there are three different asset classes in art. The first asset class is when you buy an impressionist painting, for example, or Mark Rothko, yes? You buy a discrete object. There is no reproduced copy of that, which has any value whatsoever. And it's unique, yes? That's the big art market to which we are more accustomed. But there are two other art markets. There is a market in a reproducible object, such as work on paper. There is, for example, prints, aquatints, etchings, woodcuts, linotypes, and all of those things, yes? Serigraphs and things like that, yes? There is a limited number of them, but they will reproduce. So you can have 2, 3 copies around the world, or maybe a couple of hundred of them, okay? Pricing of them is very difficult and different as well, and that's an entirely distinct art market as well. There's a third art market, which is also emerging in recent years, and that's the investment funds. The investment funds which buy art in physical form, usually unique pieces of the likes of Mark Rothko and the Impressionists, and then sell you shares of ownership in it. So it's a divisible art market. Well, I can't really say about the divisible art market. That's just financial instrumentation. Ultimately, it's quite, the same as buying equities, okay, in companies, or similar to it, yes? When you go to the regional art market in which there is a unique piece sold, that art market actually shows absolutely no behavior of the cyclicality traditional to the stocks, bonds, commodities, or any other sort of financial instruments. It is a unique hedge across all of those assets, and it also is outperforming it in terms of risk-adjusted rates of return. It's quite interesting. So while, yes, during the recessions you can see a dip in prices, no, that dip in prices is not going to be more pronounced. The filthy rich, it turns out, actually keep buying art. That's a very interesting thing in itself. I didn't cover that. So cyclicality there is much more subdued, and it's much less pronounced as well. It also gets distorted by other markets as well. So as I mentioned before, there's some other type of the markets in art. So this is why I might have kind of cognizantly avoided it. But the interesting thing is that the invention of kind of electronic mainframe in 1960s in itself gives that huge boost to productivity as well. Except that that huge boost in productivity is really very difficult to determine whether it really is there. In 1987, the father of growth theory, Robert Solow, remarked that you can see computers everywhere except in the productivity data. It's very interesting that economists ever since then have been struggling with trying to capture what is really the return to ICT technology. And we usually go about it in indirect ways. We take out of the productivity figure, okay, the physical stuff. We can count that because we have the value of it and we know the change of it. Yeah, you build a new factory building, there is a value change. Yes, I can attach to that value change in the output of the firm. Yes, that's fine. Okay. Then we can take out maybe some part of the labor as well, because we know how many hours of the type of labor that have worked, and there is a change as well. What's the residual is we call total factor productivity, effectively, yes? Now, total factor productivity is everything but the other two. That is basically technology. We're starting now, in recent years, to move towards directly trying to measure the productivity of technology. But this is only the beginning. This stuff has been around since 1960s. It's very interesting because you have to be very careful. I wrote a paper, well, co-authored the paper with a bunch actually of people. I didn't write it alone. It was about, oh geez, 8 of us who wrote it, And the paper was actually very contrived in many ways because it's a very controlled environment. What we were asked to do, I was at the time in IBM and we did an academic paper on that. We were asked to look at what the returns to the supercomputing are. So, not personal computers that every dog in the street has several of, okay? But the very unique pieces of equipment. Unique pieces of equipment which are actually fully cataloged. In the United States, there is a full registry of supercomputers, and it's publicly available. We know the age of the supercomputer, we know the parameters of every supercomputer, and we know where it is bought, at what price it is bought. We know where it is deployed. Better yet, because most of the supercomputing is done in academic institutions, we have the outputs. So we know how many papers are linked that are published, where they are published, how many people worked on it, how many financial grants they got from different institutions in the United States and all. So we pulled all of that data together completely, and we estimated what the return, in inverted commas, because the return is in academic papers really, or the prestige of the institution or ranking of the department that we get out of that, okay? But it's interesting enough, because that paper was one of the very few papers ever written on the whole issue of the directly measuring tangible returns to supercomputing. Yet, institutions around the world spend a couple of million a year, sometimes if not more, on buying that stuff. And when we talk about cost-benefit analysis in itself, it's quite interesting. We also found that the cycle of the life and longevity and the returns themselves in supercomputing is exceptionally small. Within the first 2 years of buying the supercomputer, the university exhausts pretty much all of the returns to that supercomputer. After that, it's gunkers. Now, we don't know why. This is interesting, because we try to figure out why it is, because the machine is still sitting there, and somebody is still doing stuff on it. And they're not necessarily reinvesting in it. But what we surmise, and this is not direct measure as well, we kind of speculated about that in the paper, that actually people migrate, the research migrates. It starts at a supercomputer in location 1, like Trinity, and then it gradually migrates over a couple of years later to the next best machine somewhere else. And it is a collaborative research which is kind of migrating like that, obviously not individual research. And it constantly is moving around. That's quite interesting, because why else within 2 years that expensive machine is obsolete? Its computing power is not necessarily obsolete, by the way. It still can stay at the top rankings of the supercomputing equipment around the world. So anyways, so this is an interesting thing, because 2-year cycles that I mentioned at the top, at the pinnacle of the supercomputing, and multi-annual, centuries-long cycles in terms of growth. That's very interesting. Gordon's premise is very frightening. Gordon's premise is that that green line is going to be the reality. For now, the red line is the reality. That's the actual United States growth data as the leader of growth globally. And then before that, the blue one, that's the UK, was the leader of kind of innovation and all as well. Global superpower, economic superpower. Now the United States then. Of course, somebody else might change there. Might be China coming in later down the road. It doesn't matter. According to Gordon's theory, Gordon's analysis, we are traveling along that green line. And if we're traveling along this green line, by the time we're going to hit the kind of demographic decay and mayhem, when we really need economic growth in order to sustain our longer living and aged population, when we really need dialysis machines for every person on Earth, we're going to be growing back at the historical long-term, millennia-long trend growth rate of around 2.2%. And certainly, you wouldn't be buying dialysis machines on the 0.2% growth. Gordon actually uses a very frightening summary of the whole thing, and there is a quote there from him. He concludes out of his studies as doubling of standards of living took 5 centuries, from 1300s till about the beginning of the 1800s, in the first stage. He also, by the way, states there that though we don't really have as good of a data, we can surmise that in the previous millennium, that was pretty much the rate of growth too. Very slow, okay? Now, no confirmation for it, but if you look at the data that he confirms, is that then Dublin accelerated to 1 century in the period thereafter, from 1800 through the 1900. And then it peaked at 28 years in standard of living between 1929 and 1957. Interestingly, that is the period during the World War II, the most disruptive war, and it's still 28 years to Dublin. Very short period of time. Now it has widened again from 1957 to 1988, 31 years. It's slightly widened as well, okay? So he's predicting that it is going to slow back continuously even further. Again, if you think about it, our policymakers currently are concerned about, you know, hey, we need 4% growth in the next year, but we're only hitting the 1% growth this year. But in the long term, the things are not looking good for the global growth. Now, I'm not necessarily fully subscribing to that point of view, and there are people who are actually disputing that point of view as well. And these people usually refer to the theory of the lumpy growth. What they're saying is that within every period of the kind of technological cycle, there are lumps. Things are not that smooth. There are little ripples here and there, and you don't know where that ripple is going to go. Okay? Nonetheless, which is interesting is that the cyclicality is there, and if cyclicality is there, it doesn't matter how much volatility around the trend you get, the trend is still down that way. That's a quite scary thing. Gordon lists 6 headwinds as to what's driving this downward cycle currently in that green line there. Okay? And those 6 headwinds, surprise, surprise, all pretty much relate, majority of them relates to the whole issue of the human capital. The biggest one and the first one is the reversal of the demographic dividend. Well, we know that the advanced economies are slowing down because our population is aging. We know that that aging is going to continue. We have no solution to it. Having children today is too late. It's like drinking mineral water when your kidneys have fallen off. It ain't gonna work. You're not gonna do anything. You're gonna saddle yourself with a twin dependency. You have too many young and too many old and too few people feeding both. And that's a problem, yes? So the demographic dividend is gone. What's even worse, Gordon doesn't really address that, but in my view, very important. Even if we wanted to reverse the demographic dividend, how do you reverse it? Traditionally, what we do is we subsidize having children. But hold on a second, how can you subsidize having children if you have to subsidize the elderly to live longer? And the resources are limited. And the technology is not returning anymore at the peak up there, it's returning already halfway towards the down. There aren't really resources to subsidize having children unless we're going to stop subsidizing being old. Tough choice. Who can afford making it? Certainly not the social democracies in Europe, and I'm not sure we should be making that, by the way. I'm not trying to advocate that as the solution by any possible means, but I'm just saying what other solution is there, okay? And there isn't, okay? So anyways, I mean, we can mandate fertility or something like that, you know, but I mean, I don't think that that would work really well in the social democracy that we inhabit or anything else. Educational attainment itself has plateaued, according to Gordon. What the hell does it mean? That's interesting because I'm supposed to speak next month at the, what's the name of that school? Cantillon School out in Kerry about the whole issue of the education and the where education as the economic force is driving us. And it's a very interesting thing. We all have this mantra, education is the way forward, yes? We need to educate our children in order for our children to have meaningful future, have good prospects for the future and everything else. I'm not so sure. I'm not convinced about that, okay? About, 2.5 years ago, I wrote, no, it was almost 3 years ago, I wrote an article in one of my kind of irregular columns in Sunday Times about PhDs on unemployment, or jobless PhDs, okay? We're heading towards it. We have overproliferation of degrees. The marginal return to each degree is declining over a period of time. I remember the days when having a bachelor's degree meant you got a big boost in terms of your earnings. Well, now, hello, even the master's degree is just a requirement for the job, like entry level, okay? Within my lifetime, within the next 5 years, PhD will be just something that you get by graduating from the kindergarten. What's next, okay? The super PhD, the academician degree. I mean, how many medals do we have to hang on our neck to convince the future employer that we actually are worth something? Here's an interesting question. How many medals do you have to hang on the neck in order to convince your customer that that which you are producing is really good and worth the money you're asking for? None, as in zero. Kaufman Foundation in the United States shows that most of the entrepreneurship in the United States in modern age, in modern sectors, is driven by people who have not completed their degrees. They can sell stuff with no degrees, but they won't hire you to sell their stuff with no degrees. That's what is the exhaustion of this education kind of model that we have. Perhaps, of course, it will change over time, but we don't know yet right now what the change is going to be like. Does it mean lifelong learning? What the hell is lifelong learning by the way, okay? I mean, I know a couple of my friends are in a lifelong learning formally, okay? As in, one of them sets every morning his breakfast time to learn Latin. Now, I keep telling him, Paul, so you'll finish learning Latin. Who cares? It's a dead language. Learn the living language. And he's saying, I'm not learning so that I can get a better employment. Which is true, he has a great employment and full job security as well. So this is an interesting thing about it, yes? What is lifelong learning? We don't even have a definition of it. It's an adult of advanced age sitting in a classroom, fine. Or it's an adult of the advanced age reading a book. Oh, now, well, let's define a book. Is it a chick lit? Or is it Tolstoy? And which one of those two is a learning, by the way? I'm not so sure. I mean, does knowing about the 19th century tribulations and trials of the heartthrob, geek, Peter, at the time of the invasion by the French,
I mean, who cares? The French are not going to invade anyone. It's useless knowledge. Chick lit is about current situation, yes? It might give you an understanding of your partner next to you. That's probably is much better applied knowledge, yes? So what is lifelong learning? We don't know, but it is actually the educational attainment itself is flattened out in terms of the rates of return. Rising inequality, this is an interesting one. You wouldn't hear it from me because I'm a pro-market economist, but we have to recognize rising inequality on a sustained level means less consumption, less investment, and less savings. If it is less consumption, I care a little bit less about that than other two. Then it's less investment and savings. That has two effects. Investment drives creation of the new value added, creation of the new enterprises, creation of the new technologies, and everything else, R&D and stuff like that, yes? But also, investment and savings drive the ability to pay in the future for your retirement age. And if we have less of that, that means there is a greater pressure on the fiscal side in the future as well. Okay? So that's not good as well. Globalization and ICT, both according to Gordon, have been mined out. Interestingly enough, I'm actually quite in agreement with him. Less so on ICT, but more so on globalization. I think we're seeing regionalization away from globalization. I think the idea of the globalized world, which we before have imagined as the flow of smartness, goodness, wealth, and everything else from the north into the barbaric and developing south, that has gone completely. Now South can stand on its own. There are regions, there is a decay in North, or at least sleepy, slow growth North, and there is a dynamic South. If before smart people out of the emerging economies went to London and never came back, now they don't even go to London anymore most of the time because the LSE and the Warwick and the Birkbeck College and all of the best universities are already coming to them there. They don't have to leave. And if they do, they go back. And what's even better for them and worse for us, now our brightest are also moving there as well. South is becoming self-sustaining in terms of both human capital but also financial capital. I always use this interesting little factoid which came up in the August last year. At the end of the third quarter, no, it was August figure, but it came out at the end of the third quarter. So anyways, at the end of the third quarter, 2012, Deutsche Bank has sold 40 billion worth of assets in deleveraging. Out of 40 billion, all 40 billion was sold in Asia, Asia Pacific. Our banks, our financial system, is walking away from the clusters of growth. As it doing so, what happens? Who picked it up? In the past, maybe UBS would have picked it up. Maybe Standard Chartered. No, actually, it is the Asian banks who are picking it up. So not only we're leaving them as they are able to pick up where we have left from. And again, we're becoming more and more regionalized, more and more isolated, more and more separate. I was talking today, for example, on Russia Today about the whole issue of the idea of the development bank of the BRICS. Yes, now I think it's a silly idea. I don't think it is making any bleeding sense. First of all, I don't think BRICS make any sense themselves. Yes, you have a high-income economies like Russia with extremely low-income economies like China and India. I mean, those are poor. This is middle-income economy. Entirely different patterns of economy. Yes. Entirely different expected rates of growth, entirely different sources of growth as well in the two. Volatility of the Russian economy is much higher than volatility of any other BRIC economy, save for South Africa, if it is included in BRICS, or Brazil. The sources of growth are entirely different, yes? Current account surpluses on a vast scale across a diversified segment of goods, trade in the likes of China, and goods and services in the likes of India, and you have current account surpluses in Russia on the back of the gas and oil and some other materials that they extract out of the earth. Brazil growth is government-driven. So they're completely different economies. Bunching them together makes no sense. But if you do bunch them together, and if you say, for example, that they need to have a global development bank, then you kind of scratch your head and say, why? What is so global in interaction between South Africa and Brazil, or Brazil and India, or India and Russia? Now, China, Russia, yes, there is a natural kind of link there, yes? China, India, there is a natural link. China, South Africa, there might be a natural link as well, primarily through natural resources, as well, yes? But there isn't really a global kind of arena on which those countries play. There are regional arenas on which they are playing, and they are becoming stronger and stronger and stronger. So the whole pattern of north-south, south-north flows, okay, is breaking up. And it is now north-north and south-south. And of course, the focal growth demographically, and where there are still educational benefits and dividends to be gained, is in the south-south in itself as well. This is quite interesting as well. Energy and environment. That is, by the way, also human capital. Do you think there is a shortage of energy in the world right now? No, there isn't. Electricity is not a scarce commodity. Put a nuclear power plant pretty much everywhere, and happy times. We can light up the Earth and just, have it as another little star floating around in space. And it will last us a very long period of time. The peak oil stuff and everything, yeah, of course there is, I mean, come on, I'm fine, Not actually, by the way, if you listen to the Cypriot government, and if you listen to the Irish, some people in Ireland, and you even listen to some people in Portugal, there are vast deposits of oil and gas in every peripheral country which hits the brick wall. The minute they hit the brick wall, they discover vast deposits of everything, Well, never mind, I can guarantee you 10 years from now, none of them would have extracted any of it, okay? But suppose, they do, okay? In that case, there is a glut of oil and gas out there. I don't think so, but ultimately the point of the energy and the environment is the fact that our human capital on one hand hasn't really found yet the replacement for the fossil fuels. Is it only a matter of time until we do? Possibly. History tells us that we will, okay? But there is also the other problem is that whatever we're going to find the replacement, we're going to still run into the fact that as our incomes rise, as we become wealthier and older, we actually start valuing the environment and the intangibles relating to the environment much more than actually underlying commodity that is being produced by using that environment. I'm not saying this is bad, by the way. I think it's good. But nonetheless, it puts the brake in terms of our future growth as well. Finally, there is a whole issue of twin government and household deficits or debt overhang in itself. I'll skip through that, but what's interesting is Gordon does decomposition of the growth rates from 1987 through 2007 into those 6 headwinds which are present right now. And what he finds is that pretty much all of it, of actual growth, is captured by those headwinds. And there is a miraculous, that last thing, 0.2%, which is really credit debt cycle. And remember that the growth rate from 1300 through 1800s was 0.2%. Anyways, I had a bit more of a discussion there, which was more philosophical, and a little bit of whether cycles help us knowing anything about the future, but I think I grossly overran over time, and I'll skip through that then. There's some interest, I'll just mention a couple of things. There's very interesting stuff. The cycles I talked about were very long. I had a slide here, this slide in particular, about cycles which are very short. And it turns out that out of the short cycles, we can learn a lot simply because it's the best data. You can extract short cycles out of the best data available, very big data sets and all. This is a research project between myself and the co-author where we took even sub-minute actual flow of orders in the stock market, in the UK stock markets, okay? And we extracted out of that the signal, sub-second and second signals, and then minute signals as well. And we mapped them across different, so from a minute to, say, 5 minutes to the 1 hour to 1 day, 1 week, 1 month intervals. And then we did a little bit of the kind of statistical gerrymandering with it to try to figure out how much of what we can model in a 1 minute or sub-minute interval can replicate or can be detected in the other longer intervals itself. For those of you who are in physics and all, what we did is we did the Hurst exponent stuff. And we found that actually a hell of a lot. Huge amount of information that is replicated into the longer time series and over the longer intervals in financial time series. This is stock markets, yes? Is actually present at a very short time intervals already. That is the bit which is the cycle itself, or the cyclical behavior, Okay? In fact, it's intuitively explainable, or at least in theory it is explainable, by the fact that there is a cyclical ebb and flow of the either smart money and dumb money, or the high-frequency trading money and the low-frequency trading money. Okay? Either kind of technical investors versus fundamentals investors. That can explain that. But it's a very interesting thing, because what we have here is the cyclicality, which is both operates at the immediate returns themselves, but also we did that for the variance analysis, so we have it at the second moment. And some other studies have shown that that exists at the higher moments as well of the distributions. There are layers and layers and layers of cyclicality, which is replicable over time and over the time horizons. Interestingly enough, we did it for 5 categories of stocks. We did it for the entire FTSE market in the UK. We did it for the entire alternative investment markets, AIM markets in the UK. Now, AIM is different from FTSE in a sense that these are smaller capitalization firms. These are smaller stocks themselves traded. We then replicated the whole thing also for the FTSE top 5 companies and for the AIM top companies as well. Now, the AIM top companies were the larger AIM companies, and we actually didn't take 5. We had to take much more than 5 in order to correct for the fact that AIM markets don't trade all of the time. So in some stocks, for example, there are days when there are no trades booked at all, months, okay, even. Then we did it for the FTSE bottom 5 companies, and we couldn't do it for AIM bottom. Because in AIM bottom, there are so many holes in the data where there is no actual price orders coming in, and you can't compute any returns other than 0 all of the time. So it looks like 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 100%, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, forever. Okay? So you can't really get anything meaningful out of them. So we couldn't do it, which tells you really how much knowledge we can extract out of this thing, how much use are the cycles, even when we know of their existence, of us in terms of predicting the future. Well, they are useful, and I'll finish on that. They are useful in a sense that as long as you don't want to be very precise about the timing of your forecast realization, you can actually get meaningful forecasts out of them. We know generally in which direction things can head. We just don't know when it's going to happen. In other words, David McWilliams is completely and 100% justifiable in predicting the last 5 recessions. Okay? He was completely justifiable in saying in 2000, for example, that the stuff with the property market in Ireland is going to end up in tears. He was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. He was forecasting without giving precision on timing of realization of that forecast. As long as you are willing to walk away from timing, cycles are very useful. What else is there useful? They're useful if and only if you actually have rich enough data set. So you have a lot of observations. This stuff here is very useful because we have huge number of observations, 500,000 minute intervals in trading for just 2.7 years. Look at the number of trades booked there, 90 to the power of 10. Sorry, to the power of 8. Huge number of observations, okay? They're not very useful in this context because there is effectively one observation. There's one period where something appears to be a cycle. And it's only cyclical because there is some sort of mean reversion. Is that a cycle? In this context, yes, it is. But normally we think of a cycle as multiple iterations, yes? It's just that, of course, maybe it is multiple iterations, but humanity is too young for seeing them all, yes? So, anyways, the predictability itself, however, using the cycles, falls as the uncertainty of the forecast rises and as the impact of the event that you are trying to forecast is rising itself. That's an interesting regularity that I would say yet to be fully documented, but certainly Taleb would be talking about that. If you divide the world in a kind of Talebian categories of the known unknowns and the gray swans, which are kind of knowable, but not yet known unknowns, and then, of course, black swans, the known unknowns, you can see that the bigger themes belong to those unknown unknowns, and you can see that they have the bigger impact, larger impact and bigger disruption and bigger cost as well in itself. So anyways, I'll finish on the slide on which I began. This is completion of the cycle. This is the very same building as in the front, except that it is taken now today. It's the same Detroit, Michigan Grand Central Station. If you're ever in Detroit, trying to get a tour into it, you can get tours into it. It's an absolutely stunning display of decay. It's a beautiful building on the inside. It eerily still has papers in the desks. A friend of mine actually documents that and just written a book about that. And it's quite a very interesting thing in itself. Detroit is like a museum, except it's no museum that you have ever visited. We go into a museum and see the bones and skeletons of animals and things like that, where they're all polished. They're all perfect. Here they're strewn around you. It's like a museum where you come to the archaeological site and there is no guard around. Dig, kick, throw a brick into the window, whatever you want to do. The question is, of course, if this is a cycle, what's next in that cycle? Where this building right now for Detroit is in a cycle? It's a huge question. I've traveled to Detroit a lot, and I have a personal connection with that city, very close personal connection with that city. And I have a love for that city in some ways as well. And it's quite interesting in a way that seeing it going through the kind of attempts and spurts at regeneration and rejuvenation, and all of that ending back in that state is kind of disheartening, but ultimately it tells me that if it is a cycle, there will be a moment when it's going to go back to something else, to something better. So is it hitting the bottom, or is it hitting the reboot button? I don't know. It's a big question for us in Ireland right now. Are we at the bottom and we're not going to rise? Are we at this type of dynamic? Or are we at the traditional cyclical dynamic, something like that? It's a huge question for us in Ireland because it, different forecasts, different outlooks, even in the shorter term out of the cycle, suggest that we're going to go back to the very high rates of growth in the future, and that's on what we predicate the analysis of so-called sustainability of our debt. But the big question is, if it's a traditional cycle and we have exhausted our rates of growth. And it's a huge question for Ireland as well, because what were our rates of growth? Remember here, this kind of inflated expectations what drives you to the peak, yes? That's the deviation from the trend, long-term flat line at the kind of in-between, yes? We had inflated expectation in this country, and we had inflated expectation in this country since 1997, probably even before that, yes? I remember in 2000 when I arrived in this country, the bragging statement was, we make in Ireland more software than anywhere else in the world. No, what do you mean you make it? I mean, where's Microsoft? Oh, there's a building in Sandyford which is Microsoft. Okay, well, okay, that's not really the kind of on the scale even of Microsoft headquarters. So what do you mean you make it? Well, we put it in the boxes, yes? We get the diskettes, we put them in the boxes, we seal it, put the tag, in a scannable little, thing, the code bar, and we ship it out. Oh, you make it. All right, yes, okay, I understand. This is the problem. We've lived in a bubble for a very long period of time. The property bubble that we think of, just started somewhere around 2003 in terms of time, and it's really started before that. But before that, we had a bubble as well. We had the ICT bubble. So if you take the generational issues, yes, go back to that generational chart, yes? If you think of slow-moving cycles and everything else, we have a generation of entrepreneurs in this country who are raised on expectation that putting money into a dot-com company that everyone is putting money into, following the herd, or putting it into the bungalow development in Lahinch is the true business and true investment. Now, that's frightening. Because that generation is lost, it's gone. It's no longer going to find the footing because guess what? The value of the bungalow in Lahinch is nowhere near the grossly inflated expectations on which the first valuations of that investment were based on. And put money into dot-com company with not even an idea of what they're going to produce, let alone of what their market looks like, just because it has .com at the end, is also the same as putting money into the bungalows in Lahinch. Anyways, I'll stop at that stage because I can talk about all of that forever, and we want to give you a chance to have a Q&A as well. So anyways, thanks a lot for your attention. I hope I didn't put you all to sleep. Should I choose the depressing slide to hold while we're doing the Q&A or the optimistic one? Let's go to optimistic. It's great. It's a beautiful building. Anyways. Yeah, whatever you want to do. Yeah.
We have a microphone. I know we've run a little over time, but if anyone has one or two questions, we can do them quite quickly. Joe has a microphone if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask anything. Is there anything over here? Yeah.
On all the short-term cycles that you showed there.
There's just a microphone coming to you now.
Just on all the short-term ones that you showed there, was there government intervention in terms of printing money like all the big central banks are doing currently? In any of those previous cycles, so the one that we're going through now, which we seem to be trying to inflate ourselves out of it, and sort of coming from that, is this the first time really that you're getting risk for free because the banks aren't going bust, they're being propped up, so basically it means whatever trading that the banks do going forward is essentially risk free, and I'm just wondering, has that ever happened before?
Okay, has there been interventions? Yes. There have been a lot of interventions in the short run and in the long run as well. If you go back to that chart where the policy rates are kind of smoothed over the kind of, over a longer trend, okay, they start in the 20% territory. Okay, so 1970s, the interest rates were huge, very high. Okay, since then there have been dual interventions. Dual interventions in the sense for every cycle, business cycle, the central banks, the likes of Fed, have stepped in and eased the rates periodically and then went up, okay? ECB has done that as well. For example, during the slowdown in the noughties after the dot-com bubble, there have been an improvement as well in the interest rates. There were lower interest rates as well. There was policy reaction. The Fed has very aggressively reacted to certain, pre-dot-com bubble as well, which actually fueled the dot-com bubble in the sense that Y2K, for example, was anticipated as the requiring major intervention by the Fed. Fed intervened very aggressively. That drove the interest rate significantly and fueled the rates of growth in following that. So you have interventions by the central banks, but what worries me more is the long-term driving of the interest rates down. And that is really over the last, say, 30 years has happened. Okay, so we've gone from the average rates in 20s to average rates today. I don't remember what the G7 average rate right now is. I've done that recently. I looked at it. But it's basically Australia is an outlier. Everybody else is down at the bottom. Now, Japan is, of course, at 0. And then you have 0.75, the ECB, and DCB is above the average for G7. Okay, so yes, we have driven the rates down. Does that mean that somebody earns money for free? Yeah. I mean, the stock market right now is booming, so if you have the stocks, yeah, you earn the money for free, effectively. What else is there? If you have a bank, you earn the money for free through the carry trade. Is that completely mispriced in the risk-return relationship? Yeah, it does. I mean, in the environment in which we have venally thrown ordinary households, the core driver of the economy, the actual economy itself, at the train, and just let them die there. Sure, the train is the one which is the beneficiary, of course. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, we are giving the free money away. Interest rates are negative effectively right now in terms of what you can earn. The question from it is, if you look forward, because the past, okay, we priced that in already, what can you do? You can't go into the banks and take it out. But the problem is, what happens when they start unwinding that gravy train? That is the very big problem, because the interest rates are going to go up. And when the interest rates are going to go up, there are two things which are happening. When the interest rates are going to go up, the banks will have to fund themselves somehow at the higher cost, at the very same time as the households are still unable to pay on the loans, simply because they've never had a real reprieve. They've never had the time to rebuild their balance sheets. So as a result of that, you're going to have the simultaneous squeezing of the margins. The margin at which you earn in the profit as a bank will have to stay there, if not even drop, to correct for the fact that the households are still insolvent. And at the same time, your funding cost is rising, and the margins are compressing. It's a very big problem, in my view, going forward as well.
Any other questions? Just over here.
I'm interested in where that might lead to in steady state economics and the necessity to follow these volatile cycles, the actual necessity. And isn't it the case that there's feedback in the system, as I think you probably would have described in the minute-by-minute analysis of trading. So isn't a very real driver of that volatility all of the people not making anything, not even sticking silicon chips into plastic boxes, but the people who get 10% on every transaction? They don't care whether they're selling or buying, whether it's futures or hedging or more and more abstract financial things that couldn't even be explained when it came down to it. And they're just getting a percentage on every trade. So they don't care on the health of the overall system, the effects, the impacts globally or otherwise. It's just like a computer game. So isn't that a very strong reason for just calling it, introducing whatever's necessary to cool that system down, because it's very testosterone-led, and it's just not a very sensible way to be at the mercy of when it has such huge impacts.
I think there are three things in what you said there going on simultaneously. The first one is the system, well, first of all, there is, people who earn on transactions would like to have more transactions. I remember in 2008, when I was in a stock brokerage, I came in with a huge mandate of change. I was supposed to take a department of about 28 analysts and change it into the department of 28 analysts, but with new people, new product, revamped, younger people, doing more interesting stuff. I had a whole program and everything else, then the proverbial stuff hit the proverbial fan, and I ended up firing about, I think, laying off about 20 people. And in the end, I just walked into the boss's office and I said, look, you've got about 8 left. Why do you need a director of research, So I kind of fired myself as well, amicably and all as well, because it was just disheartening completely. There was no point of me being in there, like, sit in front of a freaking Bloomberg terminal and sleep the whole day, So believe me, the brokers who get the, well, not quite 10%, they don't get 10%, paid for the transactions, would like to have more transactions. There are more transactions when the times are good, when there are a lot of investment, and there is a lot of churn in the investment as well. So it's not exactly true to say that they don't care. They do care quite significantly as well. In the financial system itself, there are big questions which I think you're right to posit as to what is productive and value additive versus what is value subtractive. Unfortunately, and good news is we started that debate during this crisis. Bad news is that we're still emotional and politicized about that discussion. Like, for example, we treat high-frequency trading, which you mentioned, as the kind of problematic area, the area in which the transactions all that matter. That actually is not true. Most of the research, academic research, shows very clearly that high-frequency trading is extremely important to price discovery mechanism in the markets themselves. It's not a vacuous activity by any possible means. It is a mean reversion. It alleviates, in fact, it actually acts to alleviate the peaks and troughs and reduce the volatility in the markets. It also induces liquidity in the market, and it also leads to better improved price discovery. Shorting activity was another culprit. How dare someone bets against my government bond? I mean, would you have really big attachment to the government bond? Any one of you actually hold the government bond? Have one? I do. I have a physical certificate of a 30-year treasury. It took me an inordinate effort to get to the Federal Reserve in San Francisco. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and order it physical delivery. They did, in the end. I have the Friedman certificate. It's not that good looking. The old bonds used to be really beautiful with coupons and everything else. But this one is just a piece of paper, effectively. And anyways, no, I mean, like, why would you? It's a financial instrument. So what is wrong with betting against something on the downside? Nothing wrong with betting against something. But what is wrong with banning it? Whether you ban it, you induce frictions in the market. And when you induce frictions in the market doesn't price things right. The risk mispricing happens. What's even better, there's a lot of interesting research that in the markets in which it takes longer time to price something, that actually boom and bust cycles are more pronounced. There is a paper in 2006 written by Jose Schenkman out of Princeton, and I don't remember his first name, Xiong. He was also at the time in Princeton as well, which started theoretical set of literature on it, but also there was confirmation in a number of papers thereafter, empirical, that the higher the frequency is, the higher the friction is in the market for an asset, the bigger are the busts. So, interestingly enough, it took the humanity until 2006 to start thinking about it in these terms, but everyone knows that the biggest busts happen in property markets. And property markets, the real estate, is the highest friction market. It's the market in which selling is most difficult and takes the longest, and therefore people suboptimally hold into the decline and therefore realize greater losses when they sell, and they also suboptimally hold into the rise and therefore realize the higher gains than they should rationally realize. So as a result of that, in those markets you have bigger busts and booms. And that's true for all of the markets. So it turns out that the short selling ain't really that bad. And absent short selling, things really get out of control and get really pretty poorly performing. So we have to think in terms of is an activity adding value, and if the value added is justifiable by the actual resources expanded. In some of the finance, that is true. In other sectors outside of finance, for example, the other thing also, the parasitic or costly relationship or low value added activity does take place as well. So it's not just finance, and it's not all of the finance. I mean, I would be careful about that, but it's a legitimate question to ask, and we don't have yet fully an answer to it, to be honest. Now, I didn't mention one of the things which reinforces, for example, your argument, and this is interesting enough. I had this conversation, it surprised me. It actually, I'm not a financial markets kind of on the regulatory side or anything person, okay? I'm investment side, you know, so I don't really concern myself usually with the stuff of like nitty-gritty of regulation and everything else. But it's interesting enough, I was in a conversation, you know, just a friendly conversation with somebody who is advising the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States, and he was saying then, it was 2009, so it was really high up in terms of the concerns and everything else, that they had another concern emerging, and their concern was structural, that high-frequency trading, for example, is so fast now that even in theory, you no longer have the necessary sequencing of the public disclosure of information. In other words, by the time the information is meaningfully publicly disclosed, material information relating to the valuation, for example, of the firm, which by law has to be first disclosed before the market action can take place, the market has already done it. So in other words, the trades arrive faster than information arrives. And this is a big problem for them. And it's literally because of the distance between the terminals. The trading happens, you know, it's physical. It's so fast now happening that it is physical distance which determines the nanoseconds of difference. Interestingly enough, yeah, some people it sounds semantic, but the market is about price discovery, and price discovery is about the information. And if the information is, or the users of the information in pricing things are at a distinct physical disadvantage which cannot be overcome relative to those who are executing trades on the basis of the momentum, big problem. The market's whole raison d'etre disappears as well then. Now there I would agree that is a problem. How do you deal with that, slowing it down? Maybe. I don't know yet.
I think we're going to finish up there now. Thank you again for coming along tonight. The next event in the SFI Speaker Series is on the 11th of April. Nicholas Collins will be over from the Art Institute of Chicago to talk about making sounds by ripping technology apart. So have a look at that. In the meantime, I'd like you to help me thank Constantin again for a fascinating talk this evening and for joining us here at Science Gallery. Thanks, Constantin.